World leaders, compelled by the influence of the Defense Department, endorsed the militarization of space. Nuclear weapons were now banned from space, but on Earth, they were proliferating.
With both sections of this divided world in possession of unbelievably destructive weapons, mankind approaches a state where mutual annihilation becomes a possibility. Earth satellites, in themselves, have no direct present effect upon the nation's security. However, there is real military significance to these launchings.
Dreading nuclear attack, the U.S. and USSR longed to know the position and power of its enemy stockpiles. Each dispatched satellites to spy, day and night, over the other's arsenal. The military contest to occupy the ultimate high ground had begun. The United States plotted the next step to weaponize space, covertly, in the early 80s.
June 12, 1982. There was a huge demonstration in New York City that day. Almost 1 million people were protesting against nuclear weapons. At that time, the height of the Cold War between the United States and the former Soviet Union. I watched it on television. And after it was over, they cut away to a right-wing conference. And the speaker that day was a man by the name of Lieutenant General Daniel Graham. And at that time, he was Ronald Reagan's head of SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. Someone said, "General Graham, aren't you worried about that demonstration in New York today? They say there's almost 1 million people there protesting against nuclear weapons." He said, "No, I think it's fantastic. They're out there protesting against intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we're moving into space. They don't have a clue. Let them keep doing what they're doing."
What if we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? It will take years, probably decades of effort on many fronts. There will be failures and setbacks, just as there will be successes and breakthroughs. But isn't it worth every investment necessary to free the world from the threat of nuclear war? My fellow Americans, tonight we're launching an effort which holds the promise of changing the course of human history. I ask for your prayers and your support. Thank you. Good night.
When I joined the staff of the Committee on Armed Services in the U.S. House of Representatives back in 1985, my first assignment was to investigate and oversee the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was President Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program.
This new national strategy represents a break from the dangerous policy of mutual assured destruction.
In Ronald Reagan's version of Star Wars, the new space shuttle would deploy the force.
When our reconnaissance systems verify a Soviet launch, U.S. interceptors are fired as Level 1 defense goes into action.
Batteries of orbiting weapons would be poised to defeat a nuclear attack before it reached U.S. airspace.
At the time, the prevailing view was that this was going to work, that the technology was almost in hand, and that this was going to change everything. I remember the briefing I got from my staff director who said not just anti-missile systems, but all major weapon systems were going to move to space, that space was the new high ground. Even then we talked about it in that way, where all major military operations were going to be by the end of that century.
It was a debate of stellar proportions. The nation's #1 stargazer versus the Pentagon's chief of Star Wars.
It cannot protect the population of the United States. It can be, by the Soviets, overwhelmed, outfoxed, underflown.
I, for one, am not willing and able to just accept the idea that It can't work.
Most Star Wars plans proved too fanciful and went no further than animations devised for publicity. But the U.S. military stayed committed to Star Wars. As the U.S. became the sole superpower, the Pentagon maintained its plan to use space weapons against enemy attacks. Star Wars resurfaced in the early 21st century under a new name: missile defense.
We need a new framework that allows us to build missile defenses to counter the different threats of today's world.
I hope we'll also move forward on ballistic missile defense cooperation.
We must develop and we must deploy effective missile defenses.
Back in 2000, when President Bush took office, he and his cadre of people that surrounded him, you think of Paul Wolfowitz, you think of Donald Rumsfeld, you think of Dick Cheney, all of them really only had two priorities. One was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. The second was to build a missile defense system.
Good morning. I've just concluded a meeting of my National Security Council. We reviewed what I've discussed with my friend President Vladimir Putin over the course of many meetings and many months, and that is the need for America to move beyond the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty.
When George W. Bush became president, immediately he gave 6-month notice to Russia that we're pulling out, the United States is pulling out of the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, that limited the United States' ability to test and deploy anti-satellite weapons, so-called missile defense systems, and other space technology.
At the Pentagon today, a warning that space will become the next big battlegrounds. To meet the challenge, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is making space a top Pentagon priority, putting a 4-star general at the head of a new Air Force Space Command to take charge of all military space activity, including any new anti-missile defense.
Pay careful attention to promoting our interest in space.
Pentagon officials say it's the first step toward eventually putting weapons into space.
Mr. Secretary, the budget proposes spending $8.3 billion on the full range of ballistic missile defense programs. This is an increase over last year of nearly 60%, or $3 billion.
It is a lot of the taxpayers' money. On the other hand, the President intends to have ballistic missile defense to protect the population centers of the United States as well as of our friends and allies and deployed forces.
I have a valid missile event. I agree, that's a valid event. You have 2 for track 0001.
Today's Air Force fights missile defense war games, in which so-called rogue nations attack American cities.
Possible impact in San Francisco, sir.
In reality, who would launch such attacks against the USA?
The interesting thing is that the threat is actually shrinking, not increasing. The ballistic missile threat is declining. There are far fewer ballistic missiles in the world now than there were 15 years ago. There are fewer countries with ballistic missile programs. There are fewer hostile countries to the United States with ballistic missile programs. When you look at it, it really comes down to a handful of states whose programs we worry about, North Korea and Iran, basically, and they only have medium-range missiles. That is, they can't reach the United States.
From Ronald Reagan onwards, every president has secured funding for missile defense under various guises, using various funds, for a total of at least $200 billion. Are U.S. taxpayers getting what they pay for?
It's a con. It's a con. Missile defense is the greatest fraud in the Department of Defense, and believe me, it's had a lot of competitors. I really believe this. Missile defense is the longest-running fraud in the history of the U.S. Department of Defense.
If a ballistic strike is implausible, why repel it at such cost? From space. What if missile defense disguised ambitions broader than destroying only missiles?
There's going to be an inherent anti-satellite capability with any ballistic missile defense system, regardless of whether it's located in space or elsewhere. And I think that that's effectively unavoidable. Targeting a ballistic missile in some senses is more difficult than targeting a satellite, and therefore targeting a satellite is almost always a capability that's associated with missile defense system.
In February 2008, the United States destroyed a disabled satellite of its own with missile defense interceptors. The U.S. demonstrated that these interceptors, also called kill vehicles, can obliterate any satellite in low Earth orbit.
Missile defense is a Trojan horse. It has nothing to do with defense whatsoever. It's all about projecting power. It's about offense. I've been to the bases in Colorado Springs, and I've personally seen over the door where it says Master of Space. And I've read the documents, Vision for 2020, and a whole array of other military Space Command documents that have said for years that the U.S. will control space, that we will dominate space, that we will deny other countries access to space. We, 5% of the world's population in the United States, are going to deny other countries access to space. I mean, absolutely provocative.
I would tell you that we are so dominant in space that I pity a country that would come up against us. The synergy with air, land, and sea forces and our ability to control the battle space and seize the high ground is devastating.
We're going to reel 38 at Ascension. Ascension 8, AFTAC arms open. Command's good.
You have no open jobs, bids until 1727.
America now has the chance to establish an American empire, Pax Americana, that will last for many, many decades. And one of the ways to do this is to establish strong American control of space.
By advancing space weaponry, the United States nurtures its economy and its sphere of control. It guards interests at home and to the outermost frontiers, in the tradition of empires.
If you look at history, countries, including the United States, had to at first develop armies to defend themselves. So the United States needed an army to defend itself against the indigenous population who we were exterminating as we expanded across the national territory, and to defend ourselves against Mexico, and we stole half of Mexico, and so on and so forth. For that, you needed armies, and also intervention, and so on. And then countries also developed navies, like, the British had to develop a navy to defend themselves against people in India and Africa and so on. And as they describe it, they're pretty frank about it. They say they had to develop navies to protect commercial interests and investment. And same with us. And now there's a new frontier, space, and we have to move on to control space in order to protect commercial interests and investment.